Karen Grassle never expected to hear from Michael Landon again. Not after everything he'd said, and everything he'd never taken back. But then, just when she thought the past was finally behind her, came a moment she hadn't prepared for. A few quiet words that unraveled decades of pain. To the world, Michael Landon was America's favorite father figure. But behind the scenes of Little House on the Prairie, Karen saw another side. One that left scars she carried long after the cameras stopped rolling. For years, she stayed quiet. Even in her memoir, the full truth was layered in grace and restraint. But now, at 82, Karen has finally shared what she once kept private. Michael Landon's apology, and how it changed everything. Not because it fixed the past, but because of what it revealed about Michael and about her. There was a time when Karen Grassle thought Little House on the Prairie would be the role that defined her life in the best possible way. A chance to step into something meaningful. A show built on heart, family, and quiet strength. And in many ways, it was. But the experience wasn't what people think. Because while millions of viewers saw Caroline Ingalls as the calm, nurturing matriarch, behind the scenes, Karen Grassle was fighting a battle that no one could see. She trained at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. She brought depth and discipline to every scene. And yet, she often felt invisible. According to her memoir, Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, Karen wasn't just playing the wife of Michael Landon's character. She was working in his shadow. He was the show's star, executive producer, head writer, and in many ways the one in charge of the set's emotional weather. And at times, that weather turned cold. Karen wrote that Michael could be charming and brilliant, but also cutting and dismissive. She recalled being left out of script decisions, having her lines reduced, feeling like her voice didn't matter, especially when she asked to renegotiate her salary. That request, she said, changed everything. Suddenly, the warm camaraderie was gone. Michael, she wrote, became distant. Jokes were made at her expense. Crew members looked the other way. Karen felt isolated on a set where family values were supposed to rule. Still, she stayed, because the work mattered, because the audience mattered, and maybe deep down she hoped something would change. But it didn't. Not then. Years passed. The show ended. Life moved on. And Karen, like so many actors before her, filed the pain away and tried to carry only the good. Then came the memoir, a quiet release of old wounds. Not bitter, but honest. Not cruel, but clear. Karen didn't attack Michael. She told her story. With restraint. With reflection. What she never expected was how many fans would reach out and say, "I never knew." And what she expected even less was that Michael Landon himself, before his death, might have felt the same regret. Because buried between the lines of her story is something Karen never said outright. A moment. A gesture. Something private that changed how she saw the man she'd once called her co-star. And no one, not even the cast, knew it had happened. Not until now. Long before the apology, there were signs that something had shifted. Subtle things, too quiet to announce themselves, but noticeable if you were paying attention. Karen had never expected Michael Landon to acknowledge how much the tension on set had affected her. After all, he was known for powering forward, for keeping things light, for brushing off discomfort with a laugh and a joke. But as time wore on, and especially after the show ended, she began to see signs of reflection in him. Years after Little House wrapped, their paths crossed again during a promotional appearance. It was brief, cordial, but there was something different in the way he looked at her, softer, maybe, less performative. And yet, there was still a silence between them. Karen didn't press. She wasn't the type to demand closure, but that silence stayed with her. In her memoir, she stopped short of recounting one very specific exchange. A moment that didn't make it into the pages, but that, according to those close to her, stayed on her mind for years. It wasn't an official sit-down. There was no dramatic confrontation, no sweeping monologue. It was just a few words, spoken quietly, almost as if Michael wasn't sure he deserved to say them. Karen never publicly repeated them. Not verbatim. She believed in privacy. And she believed that if someone offered something vulnerable, especially late in life, you didn't twist it into something theatrical. But what she did say in so many words was that Michael understood. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to let her know that the way she'd been treated hadn't gone unnoticed. That he'd carried some part of it with him. That maybe the jokes, the control, the cold shoulders hadn't sat well with him in the end. For a woman who'd spent years swallowing her frustration for the sake of keeping peace, those few words, however they were delivered, landed hard. Because Karen Grassle didn't need an audience. She didn't need a grand apology. She needed to know that she wasn't imagining it. That she wasn't alone in the memory of those difficult days. And when she received that small, quiet recognition, it was both a relief and a heartbreak. Because by then, the years had already passed. The show was long over. Michael's health was beginning to fail. There wouldn't be a chance to build something new. Just one moment. And what she felt in that moment, what she would carry long after his death, wasn't triumph or satisfaction. It was grief. Grief for the bond they never fully healed. Grief for the man who might have changed, if they'd had more time. And grief for the words he said, because she knew they cost him something to say. But what exactly did he say? Karen never told the public outright. But what she shared next, what she finally admitted at 82, revealed more than any direct quote ever could. Karen Grassle waited decades to speak freely. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she needed to relive the pain. But because for years, she'd watched the public narrative swirl around Michael Landon like a protective fog, one that left no space for her truth. She'd read the tributes, watched the reruns, sat through interviews where her name wasn't even mentioned. To the world, he was a legend. And in many ways, he was. But legends, she learned, cast long shadows. When she released her memoir, Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, it wasn't meant to shatter anyone's image of Michael Landon. If anything, she went out of her way to describe both his brilliance and his cruelty. She acknowledged his charisma, his sense of humor, his control over every detail on set. But she also described the alienation, the jokes made at her expense. The day she asked for fair pay and became, in her words, the problem. What she didn't write in the book, but hinted at in later comments, was the private moment that left her shaken. It wasn't a scene anyone witnessed. No cameras, no cast, just Karen and Michael. And though she never quoted him directly, she made it clear. He said something that caught her off guard. Something that suggested he knew. Maybe he didn't say the word sorry. Maybe he didn't admit everything he'd done. But it was enough. Enough to break something open inside her. Because when someone who once dismissed you looks you in the eye and softens, even just for a moment, it changes how you carry the past. It doesn't erase it, but it reframes it. Karen began to see Michael not just as the powerful man who once controlled her creative space, but as someone who may have, in his final years, seen her more clearly than he ever did when the cameras were rolling. And that realization, that he might have finally understood her pain, just as his time was running out, wasn't just bittersweet. It was devastating. Because how do you forgive someone who's already gone? How do you respond to words that came too late to change anything, but just in time to haunt you? Karen has said very little about her last exchange with Michael. She's careful with her words, protectively vague. But what she's made clear, especially in recent years, is that the apology, however small, left her deeply emotional. She broke down not because she was angry, but because she'd waited so long to feel seen. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about winning. It was about finally hearing the thing she'd stopped hoping to hear. And when it came, not shouted, not written, just spoken, she realized just how much she'd needed it. There's a kind of sorrow that comes not from being hurt, but from almost being healed. And that's the sorrow she carries now. But Karen's story didn't end there, because in finally sharing that moment, and choosing to let the public in on the complexity of what she felt, she offered something powerful. Not just a memory, but a warning, a lesson, a plea. And what she said next was aimed at anyone who's ever stayed silent just to keep the peace. There's a certain kind of silence that feels like survival. Karen Grassle knew that silence well. It followed her for years, on set, in interviews, even at fan conventions. She learned to smile through it, to redirect questions, to talk about the good times, and steer clear of anything that might stir the water. Because in Hollywood, especially in the 1970s and 80s, being labeled difficult could end a career. Especially if you were a woman. Especially if you were asking for what was fair. And Karen hadn't just been asking for a raise. She'd been asking to be treated with respect. She'd been asking to be seen, not just as a character, but as a collaborator. Michael Landon was the face of the show. He wrote it, directed it, produced it. He lit up every scene with that undeniable magnetism fans still remember. But with that kind of control came blind spots. And Karen, sharp, trained, and quietly principled, was one of them. So when he apologized, or at least acknowledged what had happened between them, Karen felt more than sadness. She felt release. Because that moment, however brief, however understated, wasn't just about the past. It was about all the times since when she'd wondered if she was the only one who remembered things the way she did. When she finally spoke publicly in her 80s, she did it carefully. She didn't name names out of spite. She didn't deliver harsh accusations. She let the facts speak, softened by time and maturity. She chose not to vilify Michael Landon, because she knew the truth was more complicated than that. She'd loved working on Little House. She'd loved the fans, the stories, the meaning behind it all. But she'd also felt diminished. And that feeling had never really gone away. In sharing the story of Michael's words, whatever they were, Karen was offering something more than just closure. She was showing what it looks like to hold two truths at once. That someone can hurt you and also regret it. That you can admire someone's work and still speak about the harm they caused. And that even an apology, sincerely offered, can arrive too late to make things whole. Still, it mattered. Not because it rewrote history, but because it gave her space to finally exhale. For the first time, she could look back at her years on the show without wondering if she'd imagined it all. Without questioning whether she'd been too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult. Because Michael had, in some quiet way, confirmed it. He saw it too. And for Karen, that meant everything. She once said that speaking out wasn't about stirring up the past. It was about honoring the truth. Not just hers, but the truth of so many others who had kept quiet to protect someone else's legacy. And maybe that's why, even now, her words continue to resonate. Because if you've ever stayed silent to keep things calm, if you've ever put someone else's comfort above your own dignity, if you've ever waited for someone to acknowledge what they did, and then watched them disappear before they could say it, you understand why that moment broke her. But Karen's story didn't end with the apology. Because what she did next, after all those years of silence, is what finally set her free. For most of her life, Karen Grassle had been defined by restraint. On screen, she played the calm center of the storm. Caroline Ingalls was grace under pressure, strength in a bonnet. And off-screen, Karen often mirrored that same quiet resolve, choosing dignity over drama, silence over spectacle. But something changed when she turned 80. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the realization that if she didn't tell her story now, she never would. Whatever it was, Karen began to speak, with clarity, with compassion, and without apology. She didn't set out to ruin anyone's legacy. She wasn't trying to diminish Michael Landon's place in television history. In fact, she acknowledged again and again that his talent was real, that his influence was enormous, that his vision had shaped Little House into something unforgettable. But she also knew what she had lived through, and more than that, she knew how many others had lived through something similar. Her story wasn't just about her and Michael. It was about all the people who've worked in environments where power is uneven, where kindness is conditional, and where speaking up can cost you everything. Karen's decision to share what happened wasn't a takedown. It was a release. And when she finally revealed that Michael Landon had, in some form, apologized, it wasn't meant to redeem him. It was meant to acknowledge that even the strongest personalities can carry regret, that even legends can leave loose ends, and that sometimes people grow, but time doesn't give them a second chance to prove it. Karen never claimed that Michael's words undid the past. She never suggested that it fixed things, but she made it clear, emotionally, vulnerably, that those words mattered. Because when someone acknowledges your pain, even too late, it reminds you that your memory was real. Your experience was valid. Your voice, after all those years, deserved to be heard. And that's why Karen broke down when she spoke of it. Not because the apology was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Because it was quiet, human, imperfect, late, and in its lateness, it carried weight. She once said that the biggest relief wasn't being able to talk about what happened. It was realizing she no longer needed anyone's permission to do so. For the first time, she could revisit those memories without shrinking, without wondering how it would make others feel, without having to protect someone else's version of the truth. And for a woman who'd spent decades playing the role of the composed, unshakable wife, that kind of freedom was more powerful than anything she'd ever performed. It's easy to think of apologies as closure, but for Karen Grassle, Michael Landon's words weren't an ending. They were a mirror, one that showed her, finally, that she hadn't been too much. She'd just been telling the truth, before the world was ready to hear it. And now, at 82, she's saying it anyway, because some stories aren't meant to stay quiet forever. Karen Grassle never expected an apology. Not really. By the time it came, if it even was an apology in the traditional sense, too much had already happened. Too much had been said, and left unsaid. But sometimes closure doesn't come with a perfect ending. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper. And for Karen, that whisper, those few quiet words from Michael Landon, meant more than anyone will ever fully understand. Because it wasn't just about what he said. It was about what she'd carried. The silence, the shame, the years of wondering if anyone else remembered it the way she did. In finally revealing that Michael acknowledged the pain, however briefly, however late, Karen gave herself something she hadn't had in decades. Permission to stop protecting someone else's version of the past. She didn't need him to be a villain. She didn't need to be the victim. She just needed to be heard. And now, she has been. Her story isn't one of revenge. It's one of release. A reminder that even the strongest, most graceful among us can carry invisible wounds. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is finally say, this is what happened. This is what it cost me. And this is why it matters. Because if you've ever waited for words you thought would never come, if you've ever carried someone else's silence like it was your own, you know how much it means to finally let go. For more emotional stories, check out this video.